So this is just going to be a basic thing on Shia Islam or Shi'i Islam. So, you'd expect it to be well known, like what the differences are, but actually some of the supposedly smartest people in this part of the world don't even know. So back in 2006, New York Times published an article, and they asked the vice chairman of the House Intelligence Subcommittee, like, do you know the difference between a Sunni and a Shiite? And basically, this person, who I'm not naming here, but he's named in the article if you find the article, and he basically said that he doesn't know. He said, I don't know. And he took a few guesses. Oh, one's in one location, one's in another. So this is actually something that most people, people who would otherwise count as an educated person in the world, they don't know the difference between Sunni and Shi'i. A very common trope is that the difference between Sunni and Shi'i is political, and that there's just been a history of war. So, like, a couple of years ago, or just less than a couple of years ago, you had like Senator Rand Paul like write this on Twitter, as if Sunnis and Shi'is have been at war for 1,300 years and whatnot. So there's a lot of ignorance on this topic, generally speaking. I thought I'd begin by sort of speaking to like the source of the difference between Sunnis and Shi'is, and most people think it's just some political difference, but it's actually not it's not merely a political disagreement. The difference between Sunni and Shia is very much a religious disagreement. So if we looked into the Quran, if you treat the Quran as a historical document, forget about whether you believe in it to be the word of God or not the word of God. If you just take the Quran as a historical document from the lifetime of Prophet Muhammad, the Quran can tell you a lot about who Prophet Muhammad was and what his role was and what kind of authority he possessed. So this is a quick summary of Prophet Muhammad's role, status, responsibilities in the Quran that I put together. It's actually going to come out soon in an article that I'm publishing on the topic. But if I were to summarize it, Prophet Muhammad, as you can see from this little diagram here, he's not just a messenger. Like, he's not just this passive messenger for divine messages or Quranic recitations. He's also an active figure. He holds God's authority on earth, which means that basically when Muhammad gave an order or a command, or when he gave an instruction for practical purposes to those who believe in him, that is coming from God, and one was bound to obey Muhammad as the way to obey God. So that's very, very important, because it raises the question of, when Muhammad passes away, does anybody continue that authority, right? Can anyone else after Muhammad act as God's deputy on earth? And this was a major issue. And additionally, what you see here is Muhammad is also a teacher. He's a religious and spiritual teacher, right? So there's this idea that he's the one who guides his community to salvation, to paradise and the hereafter. And he's also what you call an intercessor. So Muhammad is a mediator. He's a middleman between his community and God. There are many Quranic verses that talk about how Muhammad will transmit God's blessings to his followers, that he'll pray for their forgiveness, that you actually, in the time of Muhammad, you had to, if you wanted your sins to be forgiven, you had to go to Muhammad himself, and he had to pray for you, and then Muhammad himself, he's the one who cleanses your soul or your heart of those sins on behalf of God. So this is all very, very important, right? The scope of Muhammad's authority. And what you have after Muhammad dies over the next 5 centuries is different Muslim communities will develop and will interpret the succession to Muhammad according to these different leadership offices that develop. So what you have here, for example, is here caliphate, right? So the Sunnis and some Shi'is have this notion of the caliph or the caliphate, who possesses the political authority of Muhammad. And originally, it was even bigger than that. And then here you have the Shi'i Imamate or Imamate, which claims the political and spiritual religious authority of Muhammad. And then you have Sunni scholars who claim only, so you could say, the theological and the legal authority of Muhammad, but they don't claim his political authority. So you have different leaderships. The Sufis, the Sufi tariqas have the institution of the sheikh or the pir. So the Shia leadership office, which is here, the Imamate, that is one of many claimants to the succession of Muhammad. So it's not even about Sunni versus Shia when it comes to Muhammad's authority. There's several competing institutions, and several of them. So the Sunni scholars, the Sunni Sufi masters, and the Sunni caliphs. I mean, these are three Sunni institutions, right? And they're all competing together. So maybe you've heard about this already, but as you may know, or maybe you don't know, when Muhammad passed away, of course, he held religious and political authority, and there are different interpretations over sort of what happened. So the Sunni view, very quickly, is that Muhammad did not appoint a successor, and therefore the community, and what that really means is the most powerful and the elders of the community, they believe that they have the right to choose a successor or a caliph. And what actually happens when Muhammad dies is that a small group of Meccans and some Medinans, they meet and they have a big argument over the choosing of a new caliph, and they eventually settle on Abu Bakr. I mean, that's actually what happened. This happened right when Muhammad was not even buried yet. His family members were washing his body. But while that went on, this group of Meccan and Medinan elders met, and they negotiated among themselves, and they picked Abu Bakr as the first caliph or khalifa. And that sort of is the root of what is later called the caliphate. And then Abu Bakr appoints Omar, his buddy, one of Muhammad's companions, when he dies. Omar appoints a committee. They choose Uthman as the third caliph. So you have different ways that the first caliphs are being chosen. And then Ali, who the Shia, of course, revere in a special sense, he becomes the fourth caliph. Then his son is caliph for a few months. And then following Ali and Hassan, it's basically these dynastic families that will become the caliphs. Then this is purely based on political power. The Fatimids are a special example because this is actually a dynasty of Shia Imams who start their own caliphate. But generally speaking, the caliphate is a political institution. It's seized by political power. And the Ottoman Caliphate is the end of that. It ended in 1924. So there's no Sunni caliph or caliph today. So that's the Sunni side. Now, what's happening simultaneous to the Sunni view of caliphal succession, and again, the Sunnis took about 500 years to come up with their theory of the caliphate. The Sunni theory of the caliphate didn't exist right at the beginning. They sort of had to interpret history and decide among themselves what is a legitimate caliph and what is not. But while that's going on, another group, a smaller group called the Shia. Now, the Shia, as an actual group, they exist very, very early. They exist during the lifetime of Ali, at the very least. And they believe that Ali is the true successor of Muhammad, and that the succession belongs to the descendants and the family of Ali through his sons Hassan and Hussein and the descendants of Hussein. So here you can see that on the visual here. And again, they're called the Shia because Shia means a group or a party. They believe in Ali as the successor of Muhammad. Why do they believe that? Because Ali is the cousin of Muhammad, his first cousin, and his son-in-law. So from a sort of blood relation perspective, Ali is the closest person to Muhammad. But the Shia believe that Ali and his family, his descendants, they've been chosen by God and the Prophet. So they believe Muhammad, by God's command, appointed Ali as his successor. And they follow different lineages. right? Hereditary lines descended from Ali, so Ali's son and his son, and then his son and his son. And these lineages consist of leaders called Imams. So the Shia revere these Imams as the legitimate rulers of Islam, the legitimate interpreters of Islam. They have religious authority fundamentally. They're also intercessors. So the Imams are intercessors between God and humans. Now, what happens is that when the Shia have to justify this, like you may ask, well, why do they believe in Ali? They often point to these historical examples from Muhammad's life, and these examples are found in Sunni sources too. They're just interpreted differently. So there are accounts, even the earliest biography of Muhammad from Ibn Ishaq. In that biography, Muhammad appoints Ali uh, at the beginning of his mission. Like he declares to the family that Ali will be a successor. And then there's further indications throughout Muhammad's life. Again, this can be interpreted in different ways. The Sunnis could interpret this somewhat differently, but the texts are there. And this is sort of like the background to then declarations that are made by Muhammad at the end of his life. So this is a famous declaration that you see here in the blue text called the Hadith Athakalain, the Hadith of two weighty things, where Muhammad says, I'm leaving behind two things, the book of Allah and my progeny, that is the al-bayt, which means the family of Muhammad. And on that occasion, Muhammad is reported to have said, he whose master I am, Ali is his master. And I think your professor already touched on the different ways the word Mola could be interpreted. But there's no disagreement that these things happened. There's little disagreement among Sunnis and Shias that Muhammad said this. It's pretty clear in the Sunni and Shi'i texts that he said this. And again, it comes down to interpretations. Well, what does it mean to leave these things behind? Does this mean follow the family of Muhammad or take care of the family of Muhammad? And does Mola mean friend or companion? Does it mean guardian? Does it mean master? And so on. So that's where the debates are. And this, of course, leads to now we're looking in the 700s. So in the 700s, there is a Shia group, and they are following the descendants of Ali. So they followed Ali's son Hassan and then Ali's son Hussein. Then they're following the son of Hussein and then his son. So the Shia revere these as their imams, these people. And there develops in the 700s this doctrine of Imamate. So this is this idea that there's an institution, a line of descendants from Ali who are divinely inspired, divinely guided. They are sinless. They have the true interpretation of Islam, and they are the ones who should be followed. And it actually, in this form of the doctrine, the political authority doesn't matter. So there may be a caliph who's ruling, but the real leader of Muslims, of believers, is the Imam. And in this doctrine of Imamate, the Imam has a lot of the functions that Muhammad possessed. So if you go back to that big table I had, or that chart I had at the earlier part of the presentation, the Imam is believed to continue a lot of that. And of course, the Shia then interpret the Quran. They read the Quran in this lens. So there are many verses in the Quran that seem to be very general, talking about leaders or possessors of knowledge, or community from the progeny of Abraham, or the light that God has sent down. And the Shia will say that this is about the Imams. It's talking, the Quran is telling people to follow the Imams. And again, what's important here is that these Shia Imams, you can tell from this quote here, they claim to be the representatives of God in a spiritual, in a religious sense, not in a political sense, but in a spiritual, religious sense. So they're claiming this authority. Now, what will happen, and you can see on this chart here, so first at the top you have Shi'i versus Sunni, right? And the difference again is leadership, the different types of leadership. For the Sunnis, the Muhammad's leadership has been basically split among different groups. But for the Shia, it has all been inherited by Ali and Ali's descendants. Now, what will happen at the time of Jafar Sadiq, the Shia themselves will split. They will disagree over who the next Imam is, because they believe that each Imam in this series formally appointed one of his children, one of his sons, to be the next Imam. But then when Jafar Sadiq passes away, there's a disagreement in the community. Well, did he appoint Ismail, who's his elder son, or did he appoint Musa Kazim, which is the younger son? And there's a lot of complications that happen, but basically you have this split into at least two groups. So the largest group, or what became the largest group, I don't know if they were the largest at the beginning, but today they're the largest group. They followed Musa al-Kadhim as the Imam after Jafar Sadiq, and then they followed 4 generations of Imams from his lineage. So they followed his son and his son's son and his son's son and his son's son's son. And what happens is that the 12th generation Imam, called the 12th Imam, he disappeared in the year 874. He was a small boy, according to different reports, and he disappeared in 874. So this group who followed this line is called the 12er Shia. And the Imam of the 12er Shia today is still in hiding. So they believe that the 12th Imam from the year 874 is still alive today, but he has been hidden from the world, so nobody knows who he is. So today you have about at least 200 million 12er Shia. This is like the large, so overall there's probably about like 250 million Shia overall in the world today. Maybe 300 million. We're not really sure. At least 200 million of them, again, my numbers might be a bit outdated, but at least 200 million are 12er Shia. So they believe in 12 Imams only. The 12th Imam has been in hiding since 874. And what happened in this community over time is that when the Imam is in hiding and no one has any contact with him, you have a new scholarly class of intellectuals, sort of like Sunni scholars, who are learned in the Quran, the Hadith, the interpretation, and they become the effective leaders of this community. And later on in the 1500s, what happens is the Safavid Empire rules Persia, they rule Iran, and they make 12er Shiism the official religion of Iran. And during that period, 12er Shiism becomes the dominant form of Shiism in Iran. And the Safavids and later the Qajars, they basically sponsor 12er Shiism. And what you have happening during, from the 1400s onward is that the scholars of the 12er community, they eventually claim to be the deputy of the 12th Imam, the hidden Imam. This is a gradual process. It doesn't happen overnight. But by the 1900s and today, what you have is you have multiple high-ranking 12er Shia scholars. So they're not Imams, they're scholars, but they call themselves Ayatullahs. And the Ayatullahs claim to represent in some way the hidden Imam. So a 12er Shia Muslim today, generally speaking, they have to follow one of these Ayatullahs in terms of their spiritual and religious guidance. And these are just some of the prominent ones. So Ayatollah al-Khoi, Ayatollah Khomeini, who Ayatollah Sistani. He's probably the most popular of the Ayatollahs today, and Sistani's based in Iraq. And you do have, and this is debated, but this concept of the wilayat al-faqih, which means the guardianship of the jurist. This is the idea, and not all 12ers believe this, but some do, that as long as the Imam is in hiding, it is permissible for an Ayatollah to basically take over some of the Imam's political roles and political power and rule a state on behalf of the Imam. So again, this is the case in 12er Shiism. So the 12th Imam is in hiding and the Ayatollahs are the ones, they're the ones being followed. But let's be clear, there are many Ayatollahs. I don't know what the number is, but there are many Ayatollahs all over the world. And every 12er Shia could choose to follow one of these. None of them really have supreme authority over the others. Only the Imam has that authority, and he is in hiding. Now, if we go back to this, the other branch of the Shia, which is important to know about, are the Ismailis. And they follow a different line of Imams after Jafar Sadiq, right? So the Twelvers followed Musa Kazim, the Ismailis follow Ismail, that's why they're called Ismailis. And the Ismailis have their own history. So the Fatimid caliphs, or caliphate, that's an Ismaili dynasty. So at that time, the Ismaili Imams, they did not go into hiding. They are on earth. They remained active in the world, and they created the Fatimid Caliphate. And now that caliphate fell, but the Ismaili line of Imams continued, and the Ismailis have their own splits. But today, the largest group of Ismailis are called the Nizari Ismailis, and they are distinguished because they have had, since the beginning, they have been following a line of present Imams, so visible Imams. So the current Imam of the Ismailis is Shah Karim al-Husseini Aga Khan IV, and he's living in the world today. He is a modern figure. He's the leader of the Nizari Ismaili community. This is what he looks like. He's, just over 80 years old today. And he's an active figure in the world. He's pretty well known in many different global circles. He regularly meets political leaders and other leaders, all the time. And he's actually celebrated by many as like a great humanitarian, because he does a lot of humanitarian development work in the areas of quality of life in the third world. But this is important because he is, for Nizari Ismailis, and there's about 10 to 15 million Nizari Ismailis, he is the 49th Imam, and he is what you call the present Imam, a Hazar Imam, which is different from the 12 or Shia, for whom there's a hidden Imam, but there's not a present Imam. But the Aga Khan, that's his title, he is the present Imam. And he performs the roles that the Shia Imam traditionally performs, back many centuries back. And his grandfather was very important too. So the current Aga Khan, he's the 49th Imam, but his predecessor, the 48th Imam, Sultan Muhammad Shah, he was very important. He was actually the president of the League of Nations back in the 1930s. Now, today the Ismaili Imam, he runs the Aga Khan Development Network, which spends about $900 million a year on humanitarian development. And the Imam sees this as sort of practicing the ethics of Islam in the world, by doing all this humanitarian work. That's part of his interpretation of Islam. And he interprets Islam, many people call this a sort of progressive modern interpretation, but basically the Ismaili interpretation of Islam is an interpretation that allows for ritual practice and Sharia and laws to change over time. So the Imam of the Ismailis can adjust how the community practices Islam, ritually and socially speaking. So today, for example, Nizari Ismaili women do not wear the hijab. They do not have to wear all those coverings. The Ismailis were among the first Muslim groups to basically promote gender egalitarianism very early in the 1900s and even before that. So it's very easy for the Ismaili Imam to make radical changes in Ismaili Islam because he's the Imam. He's not a scholar, so he doesn't have to actually proof quote the Quran or the Hadith to make a change. And as we get to the end here, he plays a very important spiritual role for the Ismaili community. So when they see him, when Ismailis see the Aga Khan as the Imam, they regard him as the bearer of the light of Muhammad, right? This idea of the spiritual essence of Muhammad, the spiritual reality of the Prophet Muhammad has been passed down in the line of Imams, and today it is in the Aga Khan, and therefore he deserves reverence and respect and love and devotion from the community. So again, this is the minority Shia group, but it's an important one. And the thing I'll end with is that Islam is very diverse. So you do have Sunni and you have Shia, but when you look inside them, you find many subdivisions. So I would just end with that it's not just about Sunnis and Shias. Uh, Islam is very, very internally complex, and we should just keep the diversity of Islam in mind. So thank you.